The U.S. death toll from coronavirus is now topping 71,000 as President Trump continues his push to reopen the country. NBC News has learned that over the coming weeks, the White House plans to wind down the coronavirus task force, a move that comes as the virus continues to spread rampantly in parts of the country.
Because the president can't speak at the task force anymore without being heard. I mean, it's all because he's being hurt politically at this press conference. If he can't talk for hours, he doesn't want Dr. Fauci or Dr. Birx to talk and educate Americans.
And there's more bad news coming in places like New York City and Chicago. New hotspots are countering the progress. Also, New Orleans. We'll get to all of that in just a moment, but this virus is not getting better.
Yeah, though it's getting better in those hot spots. Unfortunately, it's getting worse across the country. And just think about it. If you want to know how erratic this president is, his thinking, how he's acting in a way that shows he's unmoored from reality. Think about the fact that, well, yes, of course, he's going around and he's not wearing a mask when everybody's supposed to be wearing masks. Mm-hmm. That's a small thing. But think about the fact that he sets out guidelines that the doctors help put together. And then he immediately tries to get people to break his own guidelines. And he's talking about stopping the coronavirus task force at a time when deaths go over 70,000. Think about this. We've just gone over 70,000 deaths in America, 70,000 deaths. You know, a week ago, we hadn't got to 60,000 deaths. 10,000 more people have died in 1 week. Mm-hmm. Again, in the past week, more people have died than died on 9/11, died in our Iraq war, died in the Afghanistan war over 19 years, all combined, just in the past 7 days. That's from 60,000 to 70,000. Think about before that. We got from 50,000 deaths to 60,000 deaths in 5 days. And the CDC writes the White House a draft a few days ago. They get it this weekend. Using Trump administration numbers. Using Trump administration numbers. They warned the president. They warned the White House. Where have we heard this before? The White House gets a warning. They warned the White House that the number of daily deaths are going to double between now and June the 1st. And the White House dismisses it, just like they dismissed the warning back in late January from White House officials that this could end up killing 500,000 Americans. And yet, what happened the next month? The president went out, he'd go to rallies, tell people it was a hoax. Well, let me just tell you, the president can talk to David Muir. He can try to blame the Democrats, but what he can't do, is excuse what he's done over the past several months when he should have known better. And what he's doing right now, I saw in the New York Daily News, conservative S.E. Cupp wrote that the president is not well. Reading from her piece, she said, if this were your child, you'd intervene as quickly as you could. And you would. Getting them the help they clearly needed. Likewise, if your friend were acting this way, you might suggest they go see a therapist to work through some of their anger issues. Absolutely. If this were your coworker, you'd probably, I think that's actually gracious, you would alert someone in human resources. And what if this were the president of the United States acting this erratically? Not only are these behaviors the norm for President Trump, but they seem to have worsened at the most precarious and critical time that our country's faced since World War II. As we face a global pandemic that's killed over 70,000 70,000 Americans. Less than 2 weeks after unimaginably suggesting infecting disinfectants might kill off the coronavirus. The past few days have seen Donald Trump spiral out of control. S.E. Cupp continues to write, he's proven himself utterly incapable of staying focused on the biggest crisis a president can face. What's he done instead?
Oof.
He spread unfounded conspiracy theories about the origins of the coronavirus, about former President Barack Obama, and about an MSNBC cable news host. Now, how much lower can you go than that if you're worried about me? What else has he done? S.E. Cupp says he's made statements that can only be described as delusional, like comparing himself to Abraham Lincoln, inventing a non-existent letter of apology from Joe Biden, and spewing non-science about his favorite drug. It's his obsession, hydroxychloroquine. Attacking 2 female reporters for doing their jobs, lamenting that they don't behave like Donna Reed, the actress synonymous with a gender role-abiding, kitchen-dwelling 1950s housewife that she played on television more than 60 years ago. He attacked another female cable news host, calling her a third-rate lapdog. And in the middle of the night, just a couple days ago, at 12:45 a.m., he went on a 234-word rant on Twitter, complaining about an ad released by a Republican anti-Trump group whose leaders include George Conway, of course, husband of staffer Kellyanne, in which Donald Trump used words like deranged loser of a husband and moonface to describe him. Yes, Donald Trump talking about somebody else's weight. Isn't that ironic? Don't you think? As Alanis Morissette might ask. That's me, not S.E. Cupp. S.E. Cupp concludes by saying it's frightening commentary on the slow normalization of this completely abnormal behavior that we can greet the undeniable deterioration of the President of the United States with mere shrugs. And the only concerns from his inner circles seem not to be about the mental instability itself, but the political ramifications of it being exposed in daily press briefings. S.E. Cupp, New York Daily News.
She really did a good job with that, really crystallizing why this normalization of the president's behavior is now making people unsafe.
Well, and
really well done.
If somebody were doing this in real time, even not in a pandemic, if they were your child, if they were your parent, if they were your grandparent, if they were a CEO at your company, if they were a coworker, if they were a football coach for your children, if they were a baseball, you would be worried and you would take action. And yet the Republicans just sit quietly by. Now we're up to 70,000 deaths. The president's disbanding the coronavirus task force, and he's actually pressuring governors and business owners to actually not follow his own guidelines. And now he's freaking out about an ad that Republicans did, a Baptist, a Christian who's voted Republican his entire life, Ben Howe, who helped put this ad together with some people, a bunch of Republicans concerned about how Donald Trump is handling this pandemic, and this is what's freaking him out so much. Let's play this ad that's made the president of the United States get worse.
America. Today, more than 60,000 Americans have died from a deadly virus Donald Trump ignored. With the economy in shambles, more than 26 million Americans are out of work, the worst economy in decades. Trump bailed out Wall Street, but not Main Street. This afternoon, millions of Americans will apply for unemployment. And with their savings run out, many are giving up hope. Millions worry that a loved one won't survive COVID-19. There's mourning in America, and under the leadership of Donald Trump, our country is weaker and sicker and poorer. And now, Americans are asking, if we have another 4 years like this, will there even be an America?
Paid for by the Lincoln Project, which is responsible for the content of this advertising.
Really a lot to digest there from SE Cupp, and also that ad, fact check, true, on just everything that I saw there. But the president is getting, we've been saying it for 3 years now, the president is getting worse.
I'd like to also point out there will be in America whenever President Trump leaves office. So that's an up note in that one ad. Yeah, look, I mean, yesterday we saw a president who was ready to turn the page, who realizes that this pandemic that's killed 71,000 people and infected more than 1 million Americans is getting in the way of his presidency. As he says, I created the greatest economy in the history of the country. Fact check, not true. That he wants to move on. He wouldn't wear the mask. That's a signal that it's okay not to wear the mask. They're going to stop meeting for the task force. That's slowly going to go away because they feel like they've crossed the threshold. And he said out loud yesterday in an interview with ABC, there will be more deaths, but with or without a vaccine, it's going to pass. He says it's just going to pass. And Dr. Emanuel, we know why President Trump wants to move past this. It's hurting him politically. It's obviously cratering the economy. He thinks it's going to hurt his chance to be reelected. But when he does all these things and when he says all these things and when he talks about that it's going to pass, he is, of course, defying not just doctors like you, public health experts like you, but the people on his task force who are advising him. And so then it becomes up to Dr. Fauci to go and do an interview at night and politely contradict everything the president has said during the day. But obviously, yesterday really crystallized a president ready to turn the page despite the medicine, despite the public health.
Yeah, I think the real worry, certainly in the public health community, is that we're going to have wave 2, wave 3, and you're going to have a premature loosening and also an unregulated loosening of the public health measures that we've put in place. No large gatherings, physical distancing, the wearing of the mask, that have made a difference. I mean, we have a plateau. The unfortunate fact is that plateau is not really going down at a accelerated rate, which you would hope, you would expect if there weren't new infections. And you can see from the map that you put up, there are places where it's getting to be a real serious concern. Minnesota, Nebraska, part of the heartland of the president. You know, I'm not the political brother, as I like to say, but I did study political science. Any president who had 20% unemployment, 33 million people who are out of work, we would be writing that person off. Just think of Herbert Hoover during the Depression. It was a blowout election, and I think that has to be really worrying the president a lot. On the other hand, ignoring the public health is not going to get the economy going. We have a lot of polls, and we also have a lot of empirical data on behaviors that show that people are afraid to go out because of the health concerns. And you can open up all the stores, but if people are afraid, they're not going to go to the stores. And it's hard to see how we're going to assuage people unless we have good enforcement of the public health measures. You have some therapy, preventative medication, or vaccine, and those are simply going to take time. There's no way of rushing. I mean, we're doing everything we can to rush them. Everyone keeps saying if we get a vaccine in 12 to 18 months, that's going to be record time by a lot. And yet, we have to wait that long. That doesn't mean the economy is frozen. We can do certain things, and lots of experts like me have said, let's protect the very vulnerable, those with comorbidities and the elderly, and we can slowly open up some parts of the economy. But you can't do it higgledy-piggledy. You have to do it in an organized way. And I think the president is trying to get past that.
Well, but you can't get past that. Like, you could add testing to that, vaccine clearly, but with testing, I don't know one person, especially on the science or on the political level, that says using the DPA, the Defense Production Act, to streamline testing would not help testing get to the American people faster. Everyone believes it would, and this president refuses to use all of his power to get to testing. You have to ask to Republicans, when is it not okay that he's negligent, that he doesn't do enough? When is it not okay?
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.